for DACA. What is up guys, Nick here, and today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at all of my full auto flywheel builds. Now before we get started, I just want to apologize in advance for some of the background noise you guys are going to hear. Right now I'm printing out some pigeon parts on my CR10 for an upcoming build. But with that out of the way, let's get to the blasters. Starting off with my first and my funkiest build, the Bedazzled Rapid Strike. So let's start off with why I chose the Rapid Strike as my very first build. And the answer is actually quite simple. I needed something that would be not only reliable, but an absolute workhorse for HVZ. And before that, I was using a stock Stripe as my primary, and it just wasn't cutting it for me. And I also wanted something that was full auto, and the Rapid Strike just checked all the boxes for me. So for this Rapid Strike build, I am using a 2S LiPo, which is powering two Fang revamp motors inside of a 42.5mm crushed cage with a pair of Cyclone wheels. And I'm also using a Michelle 2.0 motor for the pusher mechanism and a Rapid Strike overhaul kit from Containment Crew for the mounting plate. So what that switch plate allows you to do is to install all three of your Omron 21 amp switches with practically no hassle or shell cutting, which is pretty awesome. As you can see, there are actually quite a few 3D printed parts on this thing. Not only did I install the flywheel cage, the switch plate, the trigger, and the Bobo Lolo style rev trigger from the Containment Crew kit, I also printed an extended mag release and an extended front for the absolute beast of a 5000 milliamp hour battery I have in this thing. But I'm not that big of a fan of sleeper builds, and I wanted to give my Rapid Strike a, shall we say, unique paint job, and that's why I ended up with this glittery monstrosity. But I did run into a few problems while building this Rapid Strike, and those were mainly due to my lack of experience with soldering, but I was able to figure it out, and I was able to complete my build. Now to my second blaster, the Tiger Striped Hyperfire. Now why did I make this thing? Well, this is the blaster I worked on during the world's largest mod party livestream. And basically, I had thrifted a Hyperfire a while back, which wasn't working the way I wanted it to, so I decided to completely gut it, give it brand new internals and a brand new paint job, which I quite like. One of the advantages to the Hyperfire's funky ergonomics are these flat panels on each side, which allows for really creative paint jobs. Now let's get down to the internals. This thing is running on a 2S LiPo with Fang revamp motors, as well as a pair of Bulldog flywheels inside of an Open Flywheel Project 41.5mm Hyperfire cage with a Michelle 2.0 for the conveyor belt system. But mine was absolutely ripping through darts, and that wasn't even because of the high crush cage. In my case, the conveyor belt was going so fast that the small rubber teeth on the belt were just sliding across the darts and ripping them up. So what I did to counteract that is that I went in with some plastic epoxy and small plastic bits and just extended the size of the rubber teeth on the conveyor belt so that they have more surface to grip to the darts. And that actually solved my feeding problem. Now let's talk about the paint job, because this one is quite a bit more elaborate than the last blaster I showed off. For the gunmetal bits, it was actually quite simple. I just stripped down the blaster, took the shells, sanded them down, applied a little bit of Duplicolor adhesion promoter, and then just painted the gunmetal as is. However, for the gold plates, those were actually quite a bit more elaborate. Once again, sanding the parts down, I applied my adhesion promoter, and then I applied Krylon Fusion for plastics black. Once the black had dried properly, I then took masking tape and ripped it up into the shape of tiger stripes, and then I applied them to the shell in a pattern. And once the masking was complete, I then applied more adhesion promoter, and then applied my gold, and then a 2X clear. Now the reason why I'm using adhesion promoter is because in the past I've applied different kinds of paints together, and those would more often than not just peel off of the blaster. So by using adhesion promoter, it allows the paints to adhere together better, and therefore I don't peel off the paint while removing my masking tape. So all in all, this was actually quite a fun build to work on, and I was able to knock it out in just a few days, and the results speak for themselves. It's an absolute dart hose. Now last but not least, we have the Spartan ECS. Gather around everybody and let me tell you the lore behind this blaster. Now back in the olden days of N-Strike, Hasbro released the Nerf N-Strike video game for the Wii, and within that video game were actually quite a few Nerf blasters that were completely original to it, including the Spartan ECS 12, which was a select fire auto springer that was akin to the Vulcan, because the Stampede wasn't even around yet. However, when pictures of the Stampede did leak before its release, people dubbed it the Spartan because of their fairly similar ergonomics. My idea behind this build was to create a sort of tribute to the Stampede, so what I went ahead and did is I integrated a Rapid Strike, which is arguably the spiritual successor to the Stampede, to the rear end of a Raven. And what this does is it emulates the thumbhole stock of both the Spartan and the Stampede. And on top of that, I added a nice little Sewelled Select Fire kit to emulate the Select Fire found within the Spartan in the video game. On top of that, I went ahead and gave this a super nice classic end strike paint job with a really deep yellow and a really nice gunmetal gray. Plus, I also added some black and silver accents. And of course, no Stampede can be complete without a 50-round drum. For those of you who don't know, the original Stampede was supposed to release with a 50-round drum. But unfortunately, we didn't get that, but what we did get were 18-round stick mags, which are still being used today. Unfortunately, the Titan drum had quite a few feeding issues, and on top of that, it was Elite Blue, and I needed this thing to be End Strike Gray. So what I did is I opened this up and I added an extra tension spring to the original one to make it feed way better, and I sanded it down and gave it a nice gray End Strike paint job. So taking this new and improved 50-round drum and adding it to the Spartan ECS, it's like peanut butter and jelly. It just goes together. So let's talk about the integration work on this thing. I am honestly completely surprised that this wasn't a tire fire. I did not take a single measurement while making this thing, and I'm just shocked that it came out as good as it did. Basically, my integration process involved lying both blasters side by side or on top of each other, taking a Sharpie, doing some marks, and then taking a Dremel and dremeling off chunks bit by bit until they just sit flush together. So let's get down to the internals. Once again, I'm using a pair of Fang revamps with Cyclones, but I'm using a different style cage. I'm using the Worker 42.5mm crush cage, and I'm also using a Honey Badger 2S motor for a higher rate of fire. And since I have the Select Fire kit from Sewelled, it means I can more easily control that rate of fire. However, I decided to not use a switch plate in this build because I opted to keep one of the safety mechanisms in this build, and that's because the flywheels and the pusher motor work independently, which means that if I were to accidentally hit the trigger, it would fire a dart if I didn't close the Sewelled board. So what I did, I kept the rev lock, meaning if I'm not revving, the trigger cannot fire. That way I don't jam up the blaster. All in all, the integration process went fairly well considering I was doing it by hand, which I don't necessarily recommend. The only issue I ran into was the fact that these two blasters aren't quite the same thickness, meaning they don't sit flush next to each other. So this meant that I had to go back and add extra shell pieces to the integration so that both blasters could fit flush together. And what I came up with was a really simple idea. I found really nice shell lines from the Raven that I had just cut up, and I just flipped them upside down and fit them on here, and it just served as a really nice panel to transition to the Raven shell because it went along with the little side panel of the Rapid Strike. And the reason why I added this was because I wanted to get completely rid of the weird curvy pieces from the Rapid Strike near the end right before the stock, and I also wanted to keep this flat top from the Raven, meaning I had to cut off this entire chunk. So I had to fill that up with the Raven parts I scavenged. Another thing I decided to do with this blaster is to screw the Retaliator grip directly to the end strike rail. And the reason I did that is that not only is it more secure, but it allows me to more comfortably holster my blaster even with the 50-round drum. Because if it were in the original location of the end strike slots, it would be too cramped up and my forearm would just be rubbing against the drum. So in that way, it's a lot more comfortable to holster. And those were all of my current full auto flywheel builds. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any questions or remarks, you can leave them in the comments down below, and I'll be leaving all the links to the 3D models and the parts I used in the description. I'm Nick, and until next time.